Namaskar and welcome to the 11th episode of Pustakalya Wala Podcast. And today is the new day. It's a new day, a new start to this towards investigation of the study and the research that is happening in this field of consciousness and perception and psychedelics, the resurgence of research that has been happening for a few years now. And I have decided to come and understand this field from a point of view of a layman. If this is the first time you are listening to this podcast, I'm going to explain what I do. I look and I read different papers, try to understand them from the point of view of a layman, and I try to present what I learned and what I gained from it. And I'll just see. I don't know what will happen in the next few episodes, or I have no plan. I have no set goal here, just to rather than except for just understanding what's going on. So today we are going to discuss the very first part, just the 2 pages again of the in paper I am studying. I found a few things which are new, and I'm just going to discuss them again. The paper is called Dimensions of Consciousness and the Psychedelic State by Tim Bain and Olivia Carter. Tim Bain is from School of Philosophical, Historical and International Studies in VIC, Australia. Yeah, what's that? Victoria, Australia. And Olivia Carter is from School of Psychological Studies, Melbourne, Australia. In this abstract, they talk about this new. First of all, we already discussed this yesterday, but I'll recap. This is a review paper in a way, trying to figure out how to sum up all the information and all the research that has been happening in this case of psychedelics on the effect of psychedelics on the conscious states. Is the psychedelic state a higher state of consciousness? What does it even mean? And how do you square with the fact that come up, square it up with the facts that come up from research, years and years of research in this field? There are 3 different categories of study where it has to be demonstrated whether the consciousness is improved or enhanced in the psychedelic state or not. These 3 categories are sensory perception, cognitive function, and experience of unity. Well, sensory perception would, in the first light, I haven't studied the whole paper, so I don't know what exactly do they mean by all these things. But if I have to guess, sensory perception would be the actual sensory input data that comes through into the mind, the visual data and the auditory and the maybe different thoughts that come into the mind. I guess that would be sensory perception in this sense. Cognitive functions is the second one, which would I would presume means the abilities of our mind, ability to differentiate, to distinguish between things, to reason, maybe to be able to deduce certain things, to maybe do difficult tasks or something like that, probably. And the third one is experience of unity. Experience of unity it feels like it would mean that how much does the experience feel like, how does the subject feel like a part of a bigger whole? is the duality of consciousness broken down, and you realize that consciousness is non-dual. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe that's what they mean. Maybe not. So we'll figure it out as we go along this paper. This is an interesting paper because they are going through this paper. They write this line that the final section of the article considers the implications of this analysis for two prominent theories of consciousness: the global workspace theory and integrated information theory. So I don't know much about either of them. I know a little bit about integrated information theory, which states that consciousness is the result of integration of all the information that is being processed by the brain, by the neurons and all those things. This is maybe two answers. These are two answers to the binding problem, I would assume. The binding problem being the question of why, if different parts of the brain are involved in different parts of perception, how then do we have this unity of experience, this binding problem? How is it all bound together? So the global workspace theory is one of them. I don't know almost anything about it. I've just heard this name before. So we'll figure all these things out. Yesterday, I said something about the states of consciousness versus the levels of consciousness. And I said the community as a whole has decided to call it the states of consciousness. I realized that the whole community hasn't started calling it the states of consciousness. It's a conclusion or an argument given by these people in this paper for people arguing that we should call it states of consciousness. So I jumped the gun there, but hey, I'm a layman. Conscious content versus conscious states. This is a distinction that we have been arguing, considering, and discussing for a long time now. Conscious content versus conscious states. And this paper says that conscious content, the contents of consciousness, it's kind of well understood, even though we don't know how it happens and what are the mechanics of all the different content arising is. We just know, we understand the notion of it, that okay, content can be the sight and the sound and the thoughts, maybe a sight of an object in front of you, the sound of some sound, the perception of sound, and new ideas that come into the mind. All these are content, conscious content. Whereas conscious states is not really very well understood. Different states of consciousness, it's a little fuzzy. They say that a conscious state can be looked at as a global dimension that modulates the kinds of contents that are possible and how well can the mind use those content into understanding the world around. What are the possible uses of that content? So, for example, in a state of semi-sleep and a little drowsiness, it's harder to do tough logical questions, because even though the content of consciousness is the same, the ability of the mind to go through the different logical arguments might not be as good as if when you are completely awake and on coffee and maybe on crack cocaine or something like that. I don't know, just adding it up. They are not talking about those drugs here, just the psilocybin and LSD studies that have happened over the years. And so this work considers the subjective reports and behavioral measures over the actual working of these compounds on the brain. The physiological effects of these chemicals are not really the focus of the study here. The focus of analysis is actually the subjective reports, the first person subjective reports. And this really tickles my pickle, so to speak. This really is very interesting to me. I've already talked about this before in this podcast, that study of consciousness is the only place where you can actually do this, and you should do this. The user reports is one of the data point that is important. This is a long tradition of consciousness research, which is motivated by the question of what is it like to be in a specific state of consciousness. And I've already crossed 10 minutes, but I'll talk about this last thing and then we'll go to the next podcast. The way they have been studying these states of consciousness, these first person reports, it's not all subjective. There is some order and there is some objective study to it. And through this questionnaire called the ASC, Altered States of Consciousness questionnaire, developed by this German neuroscientist called Dietrich, APZ, Abnormal Mental States Questionnaire, in 1996-1998, and this has been extensively used in a lot of different researches. So there are a lot of data on this in this format, this questionnaire. And I couldn't find this questionnaire yet, but I found a little bit, and it's about the it's asking people how did they feel. It's first of all, it's after the fact. It's not going on while the person is in that state. It's after he or she has come down from the state into the normal state. So that's one characteristic of this questionnaire. And then it's all about what did you feel, how did you feel, were you anxious, were you not anxious, and all those things. But we'll figure out tomorrow where to download this and see where it is. So very interesting. These three things will be discussed in this paper: the psychedelics and the perception, the visual imagery, psychedelics and cognition, right? Psychedelics and cognition, that's the cognitive function, and psychedelics and the experience of unity of time, space, and self. This is one of the most interesting parts. So these three aspects: perception, cognition, and unity. Okay, so there is this, let me just go through this very small. The perception is like, my imagination was extremely vivid. That's an example of different updated perception. And I saw colors before me in total darkness or with closed eyes. This is one of the examples of changed perception. Cognition usually is reduced. Perception is increased. Cognition is reduced usually. I had difficulty making even the smallest decisions, right? That's a common characteristic. Everything around me was happening so fast that I no longer could follow what was going on. That's another disability in cognitive abilities. And self, space, and time. This is the unity experience. Examples are, everything seemed to unify into oneness, and I experienced a touch of eternity. So there are these subjective ways of putting out these ideas in this research, and this analysis will try to understand what is increased, what is decreased, does it mean, um, and what does it mean to say that it's a higher state of consciousness or it's a deeper state of consciousness, and does that even, should that be continued, or should it be just called an altered state of consciousness, not a higher one or a lower one? And the multidimensional view of how consciousness can be, this is a very exciting time in research because of the technological improvements and the resurgence of psychedelic research, and its usage in curing depression and alcoholism and PTSD and all those things. So I'll end here, and we'll continue these three different characteristics of conscious states and their changes on psychedelic drugs tomorrow. See you tomorrow. Cha 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 ciao.